you've done that then. Okay, hi, welcome everybody. So this is the second event in a series of events from our project, Cultures of Digital Hate. So we are Dr. Hannah Yellen from Oxford Brookes University, and I'm Dr. Laura Clancy from Lancaster University. So thank you to the Sociological Review for generously funding 3 events this year as part of the Sociological Review seminar series. And they've also enabled us to set up a website for the project, which Hannah's going to pop in the comment box. So you can have a look around there. You can see our future events, our published research, our collaborators and resource we've gathered from elsewhere. And also, if anyone missed the first event, there's a recording of that on there where we had speakers from the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, legal scholar Cara Bacalis and Bot Sentinel. We'll be hosting the video of this event on there as well afterwards for anyone who might miss it. So just to make you aware that the event is recorded.
So this project began when research of ours into Meghan Markle got picked up by the Sunday Times with a very misleading and inflammatory headline. Laura, would you be able to pop the slides?
You won't let me share. Sorry.
I won't let you share. Okay, all right. Well, you don't get to see. The headline was academics slam Meghan Markle for dropping feminism like a hot potato, or something close to that. And obviously we never said that, because not least because hot potato is not a term that flies through academic peer review. But of course, moreover, we are not interested in policing anybody's feminism. But this account of our work was remediated around the whole world, and that exposed us to a great deal of digital hate. We were called bitches, we were called, there was a lot of kind of vitriol around telling us to shut up. The abuse was very gendered, policing my appearance and my performance of femininity when I had gone on the news to talk about our research. So rather than retreat, we treated the abuse directed at us as data, and you can read the article that came from this on our website. And as the next stage of the project, we have been undertaking a survey with academics on their experiences of doing public engagement work and having an online profile. And the results we have found mirror many of our own experiences, namely a lack of support from the university and experiencing backlash as a result of having a public profile as part of their work. Oh, it says my connection is unstable. Tell me if you can't hear me. Hopefully I'm back. I'm sorry that we can't show you the slides right now, but they are quite telling. It's like the joke when you have a pie chart and it says no and then no in a different color. Does your institution support you? It's no, and then a small percentage say I don't have an institution, I'm a precarious scholar. So that's pretty damning, I think. We've also found that many people's experiences are massively impacted by their identity. So, for example, scholars of colour have been receiving racist abuse. Disabled scholars have been receiving ableist abuse. And our aim for today is to think about some of these intersections and how the risks of visibility are unequally distributed in ways that keep the already marginalised out of public debate. So we've set up the Cultures of Digital Hate project, and we aim to educate, engage and consult on digital hate as a pervasive social problem. As I've said, we began with a focus on academics who are encouraged by employers to have a visible public profile. And we are expanding out from there because obviously it's a wide-reaching issue.
So now our goal today is to think about those risks of visibility and how they might be unequally distributed and how digital hate might function to keep certain voices out of public debate. And we've been working throughout this project in collaboration with people working in digital industries and policy, and researchers working in industry and government and academia. And today we're really lucky to have 4 amazing experts from across academic disciplines and also within policy. So we have Dr. Brooklyn Gibson, who's Assistant Professor of Communication at the University of Illinois, Gabriela de Oliveira, who's Head of Policy, Research and Campaigns at Glitch, Dr. Jen Slater, who is Reader in Queer Disability Studies and Education at Sheffield Hallam University, and Dr. Charlotte Jones, who's Research Fellow with interests in gender, sexuality, disability and health at the University of Exeter. So just before we start, I just wanted to give a few matters on the rules of engagement. So you can use the comment box for questions throughout, and we'll be monitoring that. You can just send questions to panelists. Just to note that disrespectful comments will not be engaged with, and people's right to exist on their own terms is not part of the scope of debate for today. So any comments on those lines won't be engaged with. After the event, we'd be really grateful if you would fill in our feedback form, which Hannah's just popped in the chat. That just gives us an idea for developing this project in the future. And we'll also share a link to our next event, which is on June the 30th. And there's the Eventbrite link there in the chat. And you can tweet about the event today using the hashtag Cultures of Digital Hate, which I popped in the chat a bit earlier. Okay, so let's go to our speakers, they'll each take about 10 minutes to answer the question, what would you like to see done to tackle the pervasive social problem of digital hate, and what one thing might make the biggest difference? So we're going to go to Brooklyn first, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me on this panel today. I love that this group is comprised of activists, policy folks, and academics, people from a wide variety of backgrounds, because this problem will only be solved if pressure comes from all sides. You can only solve a multifaceted problem with multifaceted approaches. So when given the question of what is the one thing that will have the most impact, it was so hard for me to think about what I wanted to distill it down to, especially being an academic, someone who is always thinking about how power operates in digital spaces and how theory is so important to even beginning to address a problem, because we have to actually be able to see it and know exactly what it is. And I just want to make a note about being an academic. A lot of times we're really good at describing a problem, researching it, talking about it, and not always so forthcoming with solutions. So I'm hoping today I can present a few provocations that get at why the ideological components of this issue is so important, and why we have to think about reframing our thinking in very basic ways so that we can even attempt to address digital hate. So I think one of the first things that I think a lot about is that we need to have clear descriptions and understanding in the community at large about what misogyny is. As a Black feminist, this is the work that I'm constantly engaged in. But I oftentimes think that a lot of people assume, they belittle that work. They don't know exactly what it is. And so I feel like getting that out there is really important. I think that people don't even realize how misogyny plays a role in the problem of addressing targeted harassment and misogyny online. And it's kind of an iterative thing. A lot of people will take the complaints and the issues of women, especially if you're a woman of color, if you're non-binary, if you're from a marginalized background, and they will belittle that simply because you're a woman and not realize that that is what is causing them to do it. And when you point that out, they still can argue, hey, that's not why I did that. I just did it because of X, Y, and Z. And so it's really hard to address a problem that we're standing on kind of as a collective community. I feel like folks who might be in this webinar are very in sync with some of these issues, but we have to realize that the community at large doesn't really understand how to frame these, understand these issues in the same way that we do. In the misogynist mind, women's opinions, feelings cannot be trusted because we're erroneously seen as emotional and irrational and things like that. And I think about like a popular primer for this being the hashtag your slip is showing, where Black women kind of on Twitter became aware of how Reddit threads were being formed around digital harassment. This is months, maybe even a year before Gamergate, and how these women got together kind of organically to push back against this and collected information, took screenshots, sent it to Twitter, and nothing was still done about it. It didn't get addressed until a larger thing happened with white women and Asian women. Obviously, it became a big situation. And so I think about how we have to think about power in addressing these problems. We have to think about who has the privilege to get their issues addressed. Because if you're a woman, you're already going to have a hurdle. But if you're also from one of these, intersectional backgrounds, it'll be that much more compounded. And so thinking about solutions, we need clearly define hate. I mean, it also feels obvious to say what is hateful, but we actually need frameworks for this, because as we talked about before, a lot of times this misogyny is manifesting itself in jokes. In my research, I see a lot of memes, social media like content that is seen as funny, and that is why it circulates so broadly. But people don't really understand symbolic violence and what these jokes do to women, how they can be harmful. And opening up a conversation about that is so important, because hate is really subjective. If you're tapped into these conversations, you know hate when you see it, but a lot of people will circumvent that by saying, hey, that was just a joke. And that is most often what we see. In the spaces that I look at, I see a lot of folks sharing anti-Black content in Black spaces. But again, it's a problem that we're standing on. People don't know what anti-Blackness truly is and what it looks like, even when it's being veiled by a joke. It's impossible to be addressed. So we need frameworks for describing exactly what hate is, because that's like the first step of kind of regulating that. And I do believe that we need some sort of regulation. In the United States, we pride ourselves on freedom, but I always like to remind folks, we can have the freedom to say whatever we want on the internet, but do we have freedom to speak freely? Do marginalized groups have the freedom to express their thoughts and their supposed beliefs? Sometimes the way that we proffer up freedom creates a chilling effect for minoritized, traditionally marginalized groups. We have to think about, what do we truly mean when we say we want a free and open internet? And I understand that this is different in other contexts, but it's something that needs to be interrogated in general. What does regulation look like in specific regional contexts and things like that? So we need to have conversations about specifically, what are we fighting for? Are we fighting for a free and open internet? Are we fighting for people to feel free to communicate and engage in these discourse? And this is a larger conversation about power, who has it and who doesn't. And we also, to just sum it up, if there's one thing that's most important to me, coming from an ideological and theoretical standpoint, we need to acknowledge that the digital world, the social world, is simply amplifying pre-existing offline social problems. So there's obviously some things we can do in terms of regulation and technological design, but we also need to recognize that within us, we have these ideological, theoretical problems in the real world, and they're manifesting in social media spaces, being taken up and circulated even faster. I oftentimes think about STEM students in the university. They're learning computer engineering, they're learning to design the built environment of digital infrastructure, but they're not learning anything about society, because there's this false binary that happens in the academy between the humanities and the social sciences. Well, I'm learning something important because I'm learning the code and I'm learning to, be a doctor. But all of those fields in the science world need to have that exposure to critical cultural conversations about race, about identity, about gender, so that when we go off in the world to create an app, to create the social technical design, the platform, we know how we might be we might be baking in bias into the technology. We have these critical cultural conversations in the social sciences. In STEM, we might be able to take a little bit of that, but those are just some of my thoughts. Thank you all.
Thank you, Brooklyn. That was great. I really like that idea of needing these terms to be defined. I think that's really important, that we kind of there isn't a broad understanding of what they are. We're going to go to Gabriella next, please.
Great. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Brooklyn. I'm going to echo a lot of what Brooklyn said. But first, to introduce myself, I'm Gabriella de Oliveira. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the head of policy research and campaigns at Glitch. Glitch is a small UK charity, small but mighty UK charity, working to end online abuse and build better digital citizenship online, which I can talk a bit more about. But that includes digital self-care, digital self-defense, active bystander behaviours, and tech accountability. We're an organisation founded and led by Black women, and we focus on gender-based violence from a digital Black feminist lens, so focusing on how we can make the internet a safer space for Black women and non-binary people as a starting point for making it safer for all. We've been working with government, tech companies, civil society, academics for about 5 years now, trying to work to make the internet a safer place. And our work is across kind of three pillars, which is relevant, and I'll explain why. So awareness, advocacy, and action. So awareness is a lot of what Brooklyn was just talking about in terms of raising this as an issue, helping people understand what we're talking about, and creating more of a public conversation about what we mean by online gender-based violence. Our advocacy work is a lot around trying to influence legislation. So that's been mostly focused on the online safety bill here in the UK, and we're starting to engage with the EU AI Act and other pieces of legislation coming out in the EU. And I can talk a little bit more about what I think the role of the online safety bill is and where it does and does not do what we need it to do. And then finally, action is our third strand, and that's where we work really practically with communities to help upskill in terms of digital self-defense and self-care, and try to spread those kind of online active bystander behaviours also. A special mention to the workshops that we do specifically for those of you who are working in academia and are finding, or elsewhere, but specifically in academia, and are finding that you are subject to abuse when you publish work or otherwise. We have workshops that are free to access if you need support and if you want to learn more about how to stay safe online. And if your faculty or institution wants to have more of a bespoke workshop and a conversation amongst colleagues, we also do that too. So please reach out if that's something that you think would help. So I think to start off, completely agree with Brooklyn's points around the need to define what we're talking about in terms of online hate and gender-based violence. We spend a lot of our time at Glitch talking to people about whether or not online, or trying to not talk about this, but having to talk about the fact that whether or not online abuse is real, and articulating that online hate and online abuse, there's no distinction there between someone's experience, whether it's online or offline, and that harm is real and has real life impacts for those who experience it. In terms of our own research, we've found, as kind of already been mentioned, that gender was the top reason for experiencing online abuse. So this was in a study that we looked at right at the start of the pandemic to try and understand the impact of the first lockdown on the prevalence of online abuse. And we found that internet usage increased, abuse increased, and that gender was the top reason for experiencing abuse, but that was very much experienced in tandem with other forms of abuse such as racism and ableism, homophobia and transphobia, and that particularly for Black women and non-binary people, that the incidences of abuse were increasing faster, were more prevalent, and they were more likely to experience abuse very much on the disproportionately at risk of abuse. We also found that influences that user behavior, their relationship with the online space, and that's where we start to see that chilling effect that Brooklyn was talking about in terms of people presenting themselves differently online, maybe not interacting in the same ways, and in some instances completely taking themselves offline due to that abuse, or sometimes just due to the fear of that abuse and seeing that happen to others. What needs to change? So I think the number one thing that would really change things from a Glitch perspective, and what we are working towards, is a public health approach to digital safety. So thinking about this as something we all have a role to play in, exactly as Brooklyn said, and something that, rather than leaning into what we're currently seeing in the legislative environment, particularly leaning into punitive approaches that are largely focused on criminalization, so creating new digital crimes and thinking about how we might do that, but rather, or the other side of it, which is in on online spaces, how we we respond to forms of abuse, how we think about whether or not we perpetuate them ourselves. And that comes back to our definitions and understanding of it, of course, but really seeing that as we are all digital citizens. And that's the way that Glitch likes to talk about this. How are we all better digital citizens, and how are we all better active online bystanders for others who are experiencing abuse? And part of that needs to be understanding what tech accountability looks like, and understanding what the role of tech in abuse. So for me to be an active bystander, I need to understand that if I respond to an abusive tweet directly, the algorithm is going to see that as engagement and promote that tweet. If I ignore that tweet but send solidarity to the person that's experiencing abuse, that's helping that person feel like they have support without actually promoting the abuse that's happening. So there are really small things that we like to promote as part of our work at Glitch in terms of how we're better digital citizens. We also think that employers have a really big role to play in this. So we're seeing more abuse in online spaces at work, Slack, Zoom, etc. And employers have a really important role in general in training staff in things like diversity, equity, inclusion, etc., cyber safety and digital safety, and kind of reducing online hate is part of that. And we believe, and we have worked with a lot of employers to upskill staff, have those conversations in the workplace, and that helps filter out to social spaces as well. In terms of legislators, at the moment, we are disappointed with where the online safety bill is. There's a lack of gendered and intersectional lens in the bill. Women and girls aren't mentioned once, although they're a group that are at evidence to be at disproportionate impact of abuse. And what had been in the draft bill around really explicitly naming the need to think about multiple and combined characteristics as kind of something causing disproportionate risk of abuse has been removed in the current bill. So we're now campaigning to get that wording back in a way that works, particularly for Black women, but for other marginalised groups with intersecting identities. Tech companies obviously have a huge role to play here, and we work directly with tech companies. We don't, we campaign against them, but we also work with them. We think that there's a really important role for civil society to play, academics to play in helping tech companies make those changes, create new tools. But that has to be with an honest understanding of how their business models are driving hate, are part of that, that kind of structural, disproportionate kind of risk, and how the design of their platforms is also part of that. And then finally, I think everyone always forgets about the regulator. So I'll mention, honourable mention to Ofcom, who is going to be the regulator for the digital space when the online safety bill kind of passes. And Glitch believes that Ofcom has a really, really important role to play here in terms of how we're working with tech companies, how we're keeping them, holding them to account. And part of the online safety bill, really important part of that, and something that we want to see more of, is transparency from tech companies in terms of what's happening on their platforms, them sharing data with academics, with civil society, so that research can be done and new ways forwards can be found. And the regulator has a really important role to play there as well. So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of many of the kind of stakeholders that we believe have a really important role to play here. There is a lot that can be done. It feels overwhelming sometimes because of the level of hate and how long it's been able to kind of create these really unsafe spaces online. But actually there's a lot that can be done, and more is happening, in these conversations like today are really, really important to that. So thanks for the invitation, and I'll pass back to Laura.
Thank you, Gabriella. That was great. I've heard, since we said Glitch will come into this event, I've heard so many people going, oh, Glitch are great. That's really exciting. So you're obviously doing really exciting things, which is cool. Okay, so lastly, we're going to go to, so Charlotte and Jen, their research is joint. So they're going to present together for about 15 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds great. I feel like I need to start by admitting that we haven't been very good at answering your question. So probably get 0 marks for this, but never mind. So we have answered one bit of the question, which is around things that we think could be helpful or could be done. What we haven't been very good at doing is thinking about the most important thing that could be done. Mainly because I think that's a really hard question. And as the other speakers have kind of already said, we're talking about a really complex set of power relations. So yeah, let's see how we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of the work that Charlotte and I do, and then Charlotte's going to do the bit where we do try to answer at least one of the questions in talking about some of the things that we think might be helpful going forward. So we share this talk today as feminist academics and researchers, and we've been working collaboratively on a series of research projects collectively known as Around the Toilet since about 2015. And Around the Toilet has examined the extent to which toilets provide a safe, accessible and comfortable space for everyone, while centering the experiences of disabled, trans and queer people. In the most recent phase of the research, we turned to think about worker precarity and cleaning labour, particularly during the COVID pandemic. So I guess that's where we're coming from in terms of the stuff we know about, and we've been brought to think about digital hate through our own experiences, which I'm going to outline a little bit as well. So I wouldn't say that we're experts in this field, but I guess have learned to manage things, and it's really interesting to hear from others, and I'm very interested in that the glitch workshop as well. So it's not only Charlotte and I that have been involved in Around the Toilet. We've always included others, or others have always been included in our work, both inside and outside of academia. And there's not been one kind of homogenous political understanding shared amongst everyone that's guided our research. The project's been explicit throughout in aiming to consolidate commitments to feminist, queer, trans and disability politics. There is an intuitive and necessary connection between these movements for many of us who, in some cases, had personal experiences of multiple marginalisation across these axes. Throughout its duration, we've used a variety of different creative and qualitative methods and created a range of outputs in order to remain publicly engaged and outward facing. But since we started this project 7 years ago, there's been a heightened, often negative attention given to trans people's lives and experiences. So trans people have been demonised as part of a wider culture war. During this time, those calling themselves gender critical feminists have positioned trans people's rights as in opposition to those of cis women, often siding with conservative Christian and right-wing organisations and commentators to raise their profile. Some anti-trans advocates have argued that feminist and indeed disability politics are in tension with trans rights. And as one of the few gender segregated spaces, toilets have been in the spotlight within these debates. As a trans-inclusive, public-facing and publicly engaged research project focusing on toilets, the Around the Toilet Project 2 has gained media attention, to the extent that we now have had to be very careful in the way that we share our work, which is what we're going to briefly reflect on today. So our focus is quite specific, I suppose. We're talking about online transphobia or trans hostility, and particularly in the context of academia, rather than digital hate more broadly. So our first experience of the press was maybe a little bit similar to Laura and Hannah, in that it was totally, or felt to us, quite unexpected and out of the blue. It was early 2017, a number of national, local and LGBT-specific news outlets reprinted an article that was originally printed in the tabloid newspaper The Sun. And the crux of most of the articles was that the project was a waste of taxpayers' money. Despite the range of people we've spoken to, trans and cis, the articles focused on trans people's access to toilets, naming trans people as oversensitive and as a snowflake generation. And transphobia and ableism converged in the comments. Commenters didn't focus on our work around disabled people's access to toilets at all, really, but they did use ableist slurs towards trans people. The heightened and often misrepresentative interest in trans people's toilet access over other aspects of Around the Toilet work has been fairly standard, and we've experienced periods of what we might call online hate since this point, sometimes, although not always, instigated by the press. Transphobia is fairly standard when it comes to this and actually gets a lot of interaction. So when we tried to have more nuanced attempts to engage with the media, we generally fail and being ignored. It's generally when there's a kind of transphobic clickbait that we get lots of interaction. And what's been interesting to the both of us is, and maybe interesting isn't the right word here, disappointing, is how universities have responded to this. So whilst my university tried to be helpful and reassuring about the negative press back in 2017, including a supportive email from my Vice-Chancellor, which is probably the only email I've ever had from my Vice-Chancellor individually, there are also material benefits for the university when researchers work on controversial topics, and press attention I would consider negative is perhaps seen differently by my institution. So for anybody outside of UK higher education, we have something called the Research Excellence Framework, or the REF. And this is kind of a periodical audit of universities' research. Part of the judgment of this research is made on impact. That is the difference, influence, or change that an institution has made outside of higher education. The better the REF result, including the impact score, the more funding the university gets. And I was tasked with writing an impact case study based on around the toilet work. When I brought up that most of our press attention had been negative, I was told that that was okay and to include it anyway. I was encouraged to read the comments and think about how it could be framed in terms of influencing or provoking debate. Now, it's important to stress that nobody made me do this. I could have pushed back, but I did feel some pressure to produce a good case study. And this meant trawling through a fair amount of transphobia, which, although not aimed as me as an individual, although that kind of individual stuff has come in, via other places, it did indirectly impact me as a trans person. Similarly, although using tools such as altmetric, so altmetric allows you to see how, if you've kind of published a paper, it allows you to see how that's been discussed on social and mainstream media. It literally tells you every tweet that the URL has been copied and pasted into. And this is generally presented as something positive by universities, but my own use of altmetric in order to track impact has often led to seeing the negative, and again, usually transphobic ways that our research is discussed. And that's something that I've been very careful on my own, for example, Twitter profile to have, lots of people blocked. So I don't generally see that, but as soon as I'm pointing to these particular tools, that is stuff that I begin to encounter. And the point I'm making, I suppose, is there doesn't seem to be very much reflection, either at an institutional or a policy level, about the risks that researchers undertake by doing public engagement and impact work. Neither does there seem to be an understanding of how those risks are unevenly distributed towards marginalised groups. Whilst as Charlotte's about to come on to, we have strategies as a research team now for making decisions about what is or isn't safe for us to engage with. This means spending loads of time and loads of energy researching, for example, individual journalists, weighing up risks, often missing opportunities that could further our research and careers. And we'd like to see acknowledgement and mitigation of this from universities and from higher education policy makers, that this is an issue of equality, diversity and inclusion.
Hey everyone, thanks Jen. So as Jen's already mentioned, developing and reflecting on our online safety measures on this project has been especially important, particularly in the last couple of years. And we've also got used to asking online event organisers for their security plans when we've been speaking and giving them guidance when it's been needed. However, we've also come to realise the limitations of these measures when they often assume that people who could cause a problem are external, potentially strangers, or at least not seen as kind of insiders. Maybe this comes back to the question of definitions and parameters that's already been mentioned. So, for example, universities offer internal work in progress or internal seminars as spaces that are kind of seen as like safer for academics because of the restrictions on who can attend. And this was understood as especially crucial during the pandemic, as public online events have the potential to be perhaps more exposing than in-person events. However, whilst internal online events may grant some protections, they also neglect the potential for colleagues to pose a threat as well. So by excluding an external audience, they may also cut off access to collaborators and supporters who can sometimes help with confrontations or abuse. Other online safety measures, such as the option to eject abusive audience members or review the list of people who've registered in advance, are also most useful if the people who are a problem aren't your colleagues as well. Similarly, we found that our press teams at the universities often give us one key bit of advice if any negative attention starts to come our way. They say kind of simply block the trolls to avoid a pylon. However, that kind of action doesn't help staff to deal with transphobic colleagues in department teams meetings, for example, or to know what to do when you spot a colleague's name on an online open letter fueling transphobia. So universities don't really seem equipped to imagine digital hate as something that can be enacted internally. And we worry this is partly a way of kind of closing ranks, insisting that academics are good and principled people who wouldn't make workspaces unsafe for others. And raising this issue can sometimes be uncomfortable as a result Acknowledging that you don't trust all your colleagues kind of feels like a bit of a transgression, and perhaps that I may also do harm is slightly awkward too. And often this will be trivialized as a kind of as an unnecessary fear, and people assume that reassurance is the most appropriate response, even when they may not have any guarantee or way of knowing the views of others. So we wonder if it's easier to talk about the big Twitter pylons from strangers or from non-academics, but more difficult to acknowledge hostility from colleagues. In the case of the negative tabloid attention Jen described a minute ago, we were told by the university that we must have been doing something right. And a similar approach was taken to other online attacks to the project from high-profile conservatives, including Jordan Peterson and the Real Peer Review, who, if you're not familiar with them, it's an anonymous Twitter account that shares social justice journal articles, and they've got like almost 60,000 followers on Twitter, and they just kind of relentlessly mock certain articles, including some of ours. So when thinking about digital hate as an internal issue as well as an external one, we may find our universities don't offer those same kind of reassurances about kind of doing something right. Internal hostility also blurs the boundary between online and offline spaces, as well as between platforms for social and for work. And it also makes the question of trust, support, and resistance even more complex. So whilst there are actions individual researchers can take to mitigate risk, which can be helpful, this isn't our emphasis today, as we don't believe that's the way to confront the problem of digital hate itself. And this is too often the focus of the discussion, especially from our workplaces who place the responsibility on individual staff members to protect themselves. I think this is one of the reasons that your project is really exciting. Of course, in academia, disagreement and critique can also be an essential part of the job, which is why an understanding of politics, power relations, and justice claims need to guide any response to digital hate. So ideas going forward, we do have like a few, even though we've really struggled with that. So first, we'd like to underline the importance of building effective coalitions and solidarities. This may be between feminist academics, but also within and across specific marginalised groups, such as trans staff, disabled staff, Black staff, and so on. We need more reflective spaces that feel comfortable to discuss the problems and how to challenge them together. We also need people in positions of power, including those in research leadership roles and on journal editorial boards, to kind of help to create supportive environments for trans researchers and trans-focused research. This needs to be understood as a core part of the work with sufficient expertise and time behind it, rather than as an optional add-on. Academia has a problem with transphobia. By first acknowledging this and its potential impact, institutions can hold themselves accountable for the hostile environments that staff are invited into. This acknowledgement would make it more possible to have collective and ongoing discussions about the institution's role in providing support and mitigating harm, both in digital spaces and in person. The most suitable next steps may kind of vary by context and require consultation, communication, trust. It's not something that we can solve here and now, but there needs to be an open and explicit commitment to making things better. Institutions also need to recognise and resource the extra burden that trans and other marginalised researchers experience, both when doing public-facing work and within internal academic contexts. An already unequal distribution of work means that women and marginalised academics carry much of the unpaid labour in universities, including through EDI initiatives, additional pastoral support, mentoring of marginalised students, and so on. Dealing with a hostile digital environment, both personally and through supporting other colleagues, takes up a lot of energy and time as well. As we've discussed, and as Jen has mentioned, the pressures and expectations placed upon researchers by their universities may be in conflict with researchers' needs, and public engagement can expose researchers to kind of quite vicious digital hate with no warning, preparation, or support. Universities need to make these considerations part of their guidance and training, and take more time to reflect on reasons researchers may not want or feel able to participate in impact activities, and ensure this doesn't affect career progression and so on. I think in academia, we often claim to take social justice seriously, but the current environment, both in digital and physical spaces, means that trans and other academics are being pushed out. Hiring in UK academia is already stratified and biased, with many marginalised groups underrepresented and underpaid, particularly Black academics, Black women especially. Jen and I have argued elsewhere that responding to transphobia in higher education is about making space for trans possibility, which in this case, I think simply means permitting researchers to do their work and to stay in the profession, which is really quite basic. Trans researchers and trans research needs to be acknowledged as important and valuable within our universities, and it needs to be protected and it needs to be nourished. And that's it from us. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much, both of you. That was really, really great. I think picking up some really important things and things we've been thinking about as well. Going to give people time, if you want to put questions in the chat, you can. I'd also like to ask, I mean, does anyone on the panel want to ask anything of each other or respond to each other as well, perhaps? I'll let that give us a bit of space for that as well, if anyone wants to do that.
I feel like while we're doing that, and before we jump into questions, well, firstly, I want to say thank you all as well for really, really great contributions. And the survey that we have done recently shows that where people are talking about individual experiences, these are not unique. This is something that we're seeing is affecting a lot of people. And something interesting that has come through in the responses is that the rewards for participation online can be actually really high, but those rewards are not available to everyone. So we'll get responses saying, yeah, no, Twitter is a really nice place, really great place for conversations and sharing, and because there's opportunities that lead to promotions and things, but these rewards are not available to everybody and are not available equally. So as Jen and Charlotte point out, this is a work-based issue of equality and discrimination, where it's not just the harms of these spaces that are unequally distributed, but also the potential rewards that are only there for some. So shall we kick off with some questions, Laura, in that case?
Yeah, go for it.
So there's been some good research recently about digital intimacy, and I was wondering if we could reflect on the ways that these kinds of digital harms, this kind of abuse, crosses over, spills, in a boundaryless way from what might be professional activity into our homes, and sometimes, in really, really personal ways. Can anyone speak to that in relation to what we've been talking about so far?
I'm happy to kick us off. Yeah, I think it kind of speaks to my point earlier. It sounds really basic to try and articulate the reality of what online abuse means in people's lives, but I do think that it's the only starting point we can go from. I think it comes hand in hand with what all the other speakers have mentioned in terms of understanding how that links to systems of power, and sometimes we feel like those conversations have been had, but in a lot of spaces they need to be articulated. But that kind of question of intimacy, I think there is this notion that Charlotte talked about of people feeling like trolls are anonymous. They're people that you don't know, they don't mean it, you shouldn't take it seriously, it's not real. And what we found is, yes, actually the majority of of online abuse from the study that we did was by strangers, but not by anonymous accounts. And I think those two things get conflated. Actually, you know, these are identifiable individuals, they are other people. And then we also found that 9% of that online abuse that people experienced in our study was at the workplace by colleagues and by superiors at work. So there is that need to understand how it plays out in different forms and in different online spaces, and that means that it plays out in different parts of our lives. In terms of how that spills over, you know, we don't just go online to do one thing. We might go online right now in this particular moment to go and talk about our work. In another moment, it might be to connect with a family member. In another moment, it might be to read something that we enjoy or watch something that we enjoy. And it's all in the same space. But if you start to understand and feel that space as harmful, all of those different parts of our lives are impacted. And so that idea of that being an intimate space, but also a public space, is really important for us to start to distinguish and have conversations about, because, you know, we need to understand that to be able to respond properly.
Great, thank you, Gabriella. Brooklyn, did you, in your different setting, did you want to come in on that question?
Can I come in on the next question? Because sorry, I'm in transit, so I have heard the question. If you want to repeat it, then I can chime in.
Did you want to come in on the one in the chat about banter? Is that the one you mean?
The intimacy question?
Yeah.
Oh, how frequently is banter used as defense? I mean, I can't speak to how frequently overall it's used, but specifically with the research that I do, and just to give you a little background, I'm, working on a book manuscript right now that has to do with this idea of network misogyny, this idea that there are specific communities of people, whether they're Black, brown, white, whatever, all around the world, who are coming together as a grievance community against Black women, right? So within those spaces, I am seeing humor used all the time. And from my colleagues, I also work as a research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School at the Shorenstein Center. My colleagues talk a lot about these folks who are organizing the Reddit spaces and things like that, how they have an idea that if you can laugh at something, you can hate that same thing, right? And so in my work, it comes up all the time, right? Oh, I'm just kidding, I'm just joking, locker room talk, and that's a really commonplace thing. Nothing on the internet is new under the sun. There's so much feminist literature about the history of how jokes against women have been used to, enact symbolic violence. But I see in this digital space, it's being taken up and circulating so much faster. And it's hard to combat it because, again, a lot of people divert to, oh, you're just taking this too serious. You're just too, you're thinking about it too hard. It's just a joke. It's just a conversation, lighten up. But these are really serious things. And so what I've been trying to do to my work is like, not only describe what symbolic harm looks like, but also outline how it connects to material harm. A lot of times people are thinking about political outcomes, right? Like, is mis and disinformation or anti-women content on the internet, is that playing any role in how we're doing politics or how we're voting? I tend to focus on like, how is this affecting women in their day-to-day lives? How is this affecting women in their, not just in the moments of when they're attacked, if that makes sense, but just in the moment altogether of how they're being represented. Because I feel like there's also a cumulative effect, right? There's this effect on the day-to-day personal level, and that's where like, I think regulation and other things come into play, where we need to have some of these, interventions. But there's also the cumulative impact of all of this content on social media that's going against women, that's coordinated in these particular ways. So I try to think about that. And I would say that banter, jokes, humor comes up all the time. It's like the primary mechanism for circulating some of the harmful discourses online.
I'm going to respond also, thank you, Brooklyn, to one of Brooklyn's points there about the continuum from symbolic violence to real, tangible, material harm. And a lot of our respondents, it's not unique for people to end up off sick from work, unable to work due to the stress of these kinds of experiences. And where Gabriella talked about, we have to first establish that digital harm is real. I think, how can we talk about this issue of safety when we are not crediting that harm as actual?
And just to come in on the banter point, that's something that we've heard a lot of, even in Parliament, of, but are we just talking about people getting offended? And the word offended seems to be used a lot in terms of trying to distinguish between something that offends and something that's harmful. We've also had conversations with tech companies who are trying to develop, hateful speech policies, and they seem to have this kind of gap around linking it to systemic forms of oppression and understanding, what abuse is and what harm is, instead of this kind of banter and offense. So it's definitely a barrier, and it's a conversation that, we constantly try to bring back to evidence, try to bring back to, these kinds of existing and historic forms of oppression. That is the only thing that we can ground it in, and we should be grounding it in to understand what's the difference between one thing and the other. And the other thing just to say on that is, what we've seen, which is reflecting now in the way that the laws are being created, is, for example, on non-consensual intimate image sharing and video sharing, we have a new law around cyber flashing, and even the current revenge porn laws are based on whether the perpetrator had the intent to distress or humiliate, and not whether or not consent was given. And that is highly problematic, and we don't want to push for further criminalization, but if laws exist, they should be based on the fact that there's no consent there, because what we found, Professor Claire McGlynn, has done really interesting work in this space, and her work's shown that actually a huge amount of perpetrators don't think of what they're doing as abuse, and they haven't done it with any kind of thought in mind to distress or humiliate the person they've done it to, but rather it's banter, it's to get better social standing amongst the groups that they sit in, different forms like that. So it's a complicated issue, and it's a real barrier, and it shouldn't be. So we need to do more about it.
Okay, we've got, sorry, Jen, go ahead.
I was just going to kind of, my hand's going up and down, go down. I was just going to pick up on something that I guess Gabriella and Brooklyn were both talking about, but also Drew's mentioned in the chat. So Drew said in the chat that in terms of intimacy, it's not taken seriously how much online harassers will literally go looking for your home address. And I think that's something that I haven't knowingly experienced, but I'm very aware of, and have really struggled to get across to my university. The seriousness of kind of, or the potential seriousness of what's going on. I mean, it's taken literally years for me to even know the right person to email to like report when stuff's happened. And now I'm very careful to report every single incident that even slightly worries me. I tell the university, even though they often, I don't think there's a huge amount they can do in the moment. I want them to have that on record, that these things are happening, and be aware of that. And for me, it kind of comes into the home in loads of different ways. So there is the like, you can get rid of Twitter off your phone or whatever, but then I work part-time, and the amount of days I've spent like with my 3-year-old trying to also figure out the best way to respond to something that's happening the next day, because I want to make sure that particular event's safe, and the thing only came up on a Monday and I'm not at work on a Tuesday. So that kind of spillage over happens in lots of different ways, I suppose. One of the things that we've started doing is like, we generally don't tweet anything from the Around the Toilet account unless we know that people are going to be around to respond to it. So unless we, on a Friday maybe isn't the best time to kind of put a new report out, because we need to make sure people are around the next few days and things like that. So we've kind of tried to find ways to manage it, but it's not bound by time. These things, are they? So it's hard to have that kind of cut-off point.
Yeah, absolutely. I was threatened with doxing, It never happened, but I was threatened with it. But I still don't know who to email at the institution.
The other thing, I think, sorry, Hannah.
Go ahead. No, after you. Go ahead.
I was going to say that all of that labour you're explaining then, Jen, like it's often like all of these, one of our real bugbears is how all this thing around kind of impact on public engagement is just simply, I'll set up a Twitter account, schedule a few tweets, promote your research. But all of that emotional labour that you just described that goes into that process of knowing you're going to need to respond to this, or, well, if something's going on, you can't just ignore it until the next workday starts. You need to do it then. And all of that kind of planning and thinking that goes into that process that isn't accounted for, and people don't, they don't seem to understand in that way, I think.
Yes, I mean, the Sunday Times picked up our piece on Sunday morning. So by the time the press office is in on Monday morning, we're already 24 hours in, and they haven't even begun to know that there is a situation to catch up with. No worries, Brooklyn. Okay, there's a question in the Q&A. Louise Holden asks, I'm interested to hear if anyone knows of research on how disabled women are groomed online for exploitation and how tech companies and individuals can manage that. Is that something that anybody can speak to, or any related issues of these questions of online harm in relation to exploitation?
I think it's a really interesting question. I don't know anyone that's done research at that intersection. I will ask though, and I can come back and maybe share some links on that. But there are organisations working in this space that might have research that's relevant to the various issues that you're talking about. But in terms of the intersection of disabled women and exploitation, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, thank you. Next one, we have, how do we define the abuse that happens online? The differences between criticism / piling on / direct abuse to individuals / abuse about minority groups. Also, what are the causes of this and understanding the context? There's a question from Hallam.
I don't really have an answer, but I was thinking, I mean, I think it's a really important and difficult question. And when Jen and I were chatting about this before we came to the event, I was thinking a little bit about the difficulty in clarifying how important it is not to be anti-conflict, and that I think that probably everyone who's spoken isn't just kind of anti-conflict, and that's not, that's just a kind of a part of our understanding of each other, disagreeing with each other, finding ways to kind of talk to each other about different perspectives. And it feels really important to be able to make a kind of very clear distinction between conflict and abuse and harm and kind of hateful actions. And I think it's partly about a power dynamic and what the implications are of the claims that are being made, of what's being done, and what in some cases what the intentions are, but in other cases what the outcomes, who's kind of who's consented, who's kind of what the ramifications are of what's being said. So it feels like a really kind of a tangled network of kind of power, and but certainly I do think that question is a really important one, and it does feel like it's not useful, I think, to understand this as a kind of as an anti-conflict stance, because it's not that, I don't think.
Okay, the next question is also, it speaks directly to what you're saying, Charlotte. So I'm interested in the original poll that asks people about whether they feel like they've experienced abuse online, and virtually everyone saying yes. However, I see transphobic women claiming they've received abuse, yet this is always either criticism of their transphobia rather than abuse, or a reaction to abuse, i.e. sharing of transphobic narratives. While they might receive negativity because of their transphobia, they will report it as misogyny.
Now you go.
I was just going to echo that it's a really tricky issue, and it's something that tech companies and legislators are kind of thinking about alike and trying to deal with. I think that link towards, so we recently worked with Twitter on a hateful speech policy, and that link towards historic and systemic forms of oppression is really important to understand where different people's experiences lie in this. But there is a need to help understand where criticism isn't abuse and abuse isn't criticism, to make sure that that's not practically understood as something different. I think we've got a long way to go on that. But there are ways to ground this in existing evidence. I think we feel as part of civil society a lot of the time that the burden's on us and the burden's on victims and targets of survivors of abuse to kind of evidence what it looks like. But it is really important work, and we need to keep talking about it and showing disproportionate impact on specific groups and looking at these really tricky issues to try and make them seem simple, because in many ways they are simple. Like, I think everyone here agrees on where that line of criticism lies, where you cross over into abusive. We're talking about, and the reality is we're talking about the harshest and most difficult forms of abuse that you can receive, death threats and rape threats and racism and homophobia. These forms of abuse can't be conflated with other things. They're a real problem, and we need to deal with them, and we need to focus on them. Once we've understood how to deal with those kinds of forms of abuse, we might be able to have more nuanced debates about where does this criticism, sit. But I think we've just got a lot of work to do first, and often this conversation gets carried by others into a space that it actually isn't that relevant to. So it's a good question.
Okay, and then the last question that I have currently has been submitted is I would love to hear some reflections about the silencing effect of online hatred, including on allies. How do we balance the need to protect yourself in the absence of any collective or institutional support with our responsibility to doing public-facing work as an ally to a marginalised group? I think this is where a lot of the advice, to just protect yourself by retreating, doesn't take into account the politics of that then being leaving this public space to be only populated either by regressive, abusive people, or people who are thick-skinned enough to take it or privileged enough to evade it. Yeah, so open to the to our speakers.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real issue, and the work that we do around what it means to be an online active bystander also talks about how to keep yourself safe in that respect. Gwen, our program manager, is the best person to talk about exactly how you do that, and I do recommend joining our workshops to kind of have that conversation. But it's something that not only we've seen play out, but also in the way that we can report abuse and how it's taken seriously, whether or not allies are empowered to do that on behalf of someone that's experiencing abuse, is something that we've been raising with tech companies for a while now, and policies are starting to shift, but they're just not there yet. So there is a need for that. We need to be able to speak out, whether it's you, whether it's your experience, whether it's someone else's experience, and that chilling effect is very, very real. I think there's increasing understanding about that, but it's just not, it's not there yet. And there is definitely a responsibility for institutions to support. So Jen mentioned earlier, you know, not even knowing who to speak to about this. This needs to be a standard policy in institutions like universities to support academics. Your public facing staff, you do put yourselves at risk, and like we've talked about, certain people are at higher risk than others, and that is really important, because often people see the only people that you can go to is report it to the tech company. Often you don't get a response and you don't feel like that's dealt with properly, or go to the police. And there are certain people that might be very comfortable doing that. But we know that, for example, Black women are much less likely to go to the police, and other groups much less likely to go to police, even women in general, because of experiences of misogyny and racism and violence within the police. So we are trying to shift that conversation away from creating the police as the institution that will support after you've experienced online abuse, and actually thinking about how are we preventing online abuse, and how are institutions like universities and employers supporting their staff that are more at risk. So we did a big piece of work with BT Sport, for example, because a lot of their players, a lot of their journalists are public facing and experience a lot of abuse. We saw that play out around the Euros, when England lost, and the players experienced a lot of racism. You know, BT did a kind of long project with us, not only public facing campaign, but we did a review of internal policies of what it looks like to keep their staff safe online, how they support, and what active online bystander behavior looks like for them. So this is a conversation that needs to be started, and institutions have a responsibility here. And I think the more that we raise that directly and show examples of where this is happening, it will become more of the norm. I'm trying to bring a bit of positivity to today, because I always feel, you know, this work is hard and it can feel a lot like you're never going to make a difference. So yeah, leave it there.
So, sorry, go, Jen.
I was just going to quickly mention that there's an irony in that a lot of this is happening at the same time. We've got this kind of discourse around cancel culture and the way it's kind of, you know, feminists, woke, the woke lobby or whatever, that are silencing other people. And the reality is that obviously that's not what's happening. Often when kind of stuff has kicked off with us, it is around that idea of like transphobes aren't being allowed to speak, they're scared to speak, and the consequence of that is we lock our Twitter accounts and don't say anything. So you have a real irony going on in terms of who can speak loudly about being silenced and who's actually the ones that are withdrawing from public spaces.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, those are all of our questions from the audience. Do the panelists have any questions for each other, or last reflections or responses to anything that we've talked about today before we tie it together and wrap up?
Can I ask a quick question about perpetrators? I was thinking, it's actually what, like, Gabriella, when you were talking about having workshops for staff, and how that kind of maybe connects to some of the things that Jen and I were saying about feeling like the kind of workplace is also potentially not always a safe place, and somewhere where the abuse can actually be rooted in. And I wondered whether or not, Hannah and Laura, if your project has kind of also had any connections with the ways that kind of, I don't know, just that the weirdness where it feels like sometimes when we're talking about the perpetrators of digital hate as like something over there that is kind of far away, but they're obviously real people with real jobs and lives, and I'm wondering to what extent like it's helpful to engage with people with the assumption that they could also be perpetrators as well as or instead of people that have experienced hate, and how we broach that issue. And yeah, I suppose, just do you have experience of trying to talk about that, or try to understand that, or to try and kind of challenge that in some way, or is that useful?
Yeah, well, one of the things that again has come through the survey is that it's not it's not unique for the workplace, academic workplaces, to be a place where the abuse continues. And one of our very definite goals for the project is to take resources, guidelines and training. So Gabriella, we are going to be talking to you because we talk about how so much of the advice deals with it only on the individual and not the structural level. It's the onus is on the individual to thicken their skin or retreat or cope, and we want to take it up the food chain within universities and make that essential and necessary and part of impact, any kind of conversation about impact, because it's not just of course the harms aren't seen as real because the labor that goes into it isn't yet seen as real. It doesn't appear in people's workload plans. It's just it's something that magically happens because we all love what we do so much, and it's just squeezes around everything magically, no recognition of the quite significant labor, some of which we've talked about today. So while our ambition is our plan is to put this work together and take it into institutions. In terms of how we enact a conversation where everybody sees themselves as that, I suppose that goes back to this kind of social contract that Gabriella's talking about, doesn't it? That it's a civic space in which we are citizens. But there's not really been a question of the expectation on us as citizens contributing it. And we can talk about all different reasons for that, like, spaces for anonymity and so forth. But it's that is a huge global conversation to trigger. I don't have a plan for that one. I've got a plan in some institutional conversations. We'll start there.
Well, I was going to say, I did a feminist media studies summer school last week, and me and the students were talking about this, and they were great, like they always are. And we kind of said, the problem is it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Kind of online abuse isn't in a vacuum; it reflects wider society. So it's about education much more widely, in terms of kind of a sexism and misogyny and racism and all those things, not just necessarily in online context. And that's obviously beyond. That's like kind of said, that's kind of a more global problem that's embedded in the platforms themselves, who, if you have people in the platforms who don't take this seriously, or who are doing codes that are codes that are inherently misogynist or racist or aren't kind of addressing these things, then those things are being embedded way before we even get to the point of joining a platform. So I think there's kind of these smaller problems in terms of institutions, but then these much bigger, wider global questions that are not something that me and Hannah are going to be able to fix, or any of us probably, but we can kind of contribute towards that discussion. I think it's important to contextualize.
As part of that point, I really like Brooklyn's point about remembering that. So we've been pointing out lots of asymmetries, in terms of the risks and the rewards, but also Brooklyn pointed out a really important asymmetry in terms of whose suffering is taken seriously, and I think that's really crucial, and partly why the next stage of this project is about those intersections of people's identities, but that's also something that that we need to tie to that, thinking about our potential for doing harm, even accidentally. So I don't know if you can hear, there's an incredible thunderstorm. Can you hear it? There are like ice balls coming at me. Anyway, that completely distracted me and threw me off. But I think, yes, in terms of the potential for having caused harm, deliberately or accidentally, but also tying that to this question of whose harm gets taken seriously, and maybe leveraging one's privilege in that process for the benefit of others. I'm going to mute because I feel like I'm in.
Okay, does anyone have any last things you want to say before we wrap up?
I was just going to add on the question of perpetrator, a couple of points. Firstly, we find that a lot of the education stuff and the need to understand online abuse, think about perpetrating it and what it means, is directed at schools and children, which is really important. But there's this kind of unspoken, I don't know, thing that we think that when we hit 18, we stop being vulnerable to abuse and we're not going to be harmed. And actually, we've all ended up using the internet, using digital spaces so much, and we've never had that kind of introduction to how to stay safe online. You know, a lot of the platforms and tools that have been rolled out globally haven't come with a how-to guide, and even some of the existing safety kind of measures that exist on these platforms, a lot of people don't know about them. And we find a lot of the work that we do with tech companies, they're saying, yeah, but that already exists. And it's like, well, no one's using it, no one knows about it, so it's not really helping. So there is that kind of need to think about education for all users, and not just, oh, we need to educate the young. And the other thing is, there's an interesting piece of research done by at Liverpool University by Dr. Craig Haslop and Dr. Fiona O'Rourke, which looks at how masculinities are kind of formed in digital spaces amongst groups of men and boys, and really how the kind of abusive behavior, misogyny, and sharing of content without consent is part of those spaces, and how it's kind of furthered by the digital space versus not. And I thought it was a really interesting piece of research of just thinking about, again, bringing it back to a lot of the people in that study don't see themselves as perpetrators of abuse. They see it as they're bonding with friends, they're having conversations, it's harmless, no one else is in that conversation, often because it's taking place in closed WhatsApp groups or the likes, and Telegram and things, and others aren't privy to it, and therefore it's not abusive. So there's a long way to go there, but I think it's really interesting to think about how we perceive abuse ourselves when we're perpetrating it, and particularly how that plays into misogyny and kind of forms of masculinities that are formed around misogyny.
Great, yeah, that's really important. I'm just reading this a comment coming to the chat. Yeah, so I like that idea of kind of it just focusing on children. I never really thought of it like that, actually, but I think that's so true. There's kind of this assumption that the rest of us don't need educating, but it's new. These spaces are quite new to all of us. We're kind of all negotiating, and they're still developing as well, and there's still work that can be done in the development of them. And I think that's partly what the online safety bill needs to look at, actually, like how can those systems develop in ways that are more inclusive. Anyone else before we finish?
Can I just pick up on what Els put in the chat about Els talking about the context of queer young people, which is probably the context I know most as well. It's like the education becomes don't use it, or it's a scary space, and not that it has a potential really helpful, which I think is something that resonates with me as well. Like, because a lot of the response from colleagues is like, oh, well, I just wouldn't go on Twitter, or Twitter's, we're not in, I'm not in a institution that's really, really research focused. So I don't particularly feel the pressure to be on Twitter, for example. I know other people do, but actually it's one of the most useful spaces to me as well in terms of getting support. So it might be the place that, you get a load of shit, but it's also the place that you get that it's really helpful too. And sometimes that nuance is lost, isn't it?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that feeds into the kind of the silence of particular voices. If you're just telling certain people to stay off, then it's not really helping to develop that conversation, is it, around having different voices and have space for different voices.
It's also very pessimistic about what the potential of those platforms can be.
Yeah, Ella says it's very similar to poor sex or drug education. Just don't do it, and that's not really the answer. It's not about the individual. Yeah, I think that's really important. And
it shrugs any responsibility for tackling the problem.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's quite a nice place to end. That it's that there kind of are positives to these spaces. We just need to address how they can become more inclusive and how everyone can get the benefits of those things that we talked about. I think these spaces can be incredibly useful. And I think, you know, one thing I was going to ask about what we've run out of time now, but like we know when the internet was kind of first being theorized, it was theorized as this like utopia where everyone can be
find their people.
Yeah, everyone can find a community. And of course now there's all these problems that have come up that have really complicated that, but trying to bring those two things together, I think, that contradict each other in some ways, kind of to reconcile those two things, I think is quite an interesting thing to think about as well.
That kind of rubbish conflict between how it has potential to be a really especially caring space as well, and that feels even more frustrating to kind of understand it as those opposing kind of purposes, I suppose.
Yeah, agree.
And also the way of accessing support in the absolute total vacuum of employers or institutions taking responsibility for the need to offer support. So yeah, very important to keep these spaces for everybody. Okay, the recording from today is going to go up on our website. I've put that in the chat. You can also sign up for our next event there. It's going to be at the end of June, and that's going to be talking more specifically, although we've talked about it today, about this question of academic public engagement and the pressures of the ref and the necessity to frame conversations about impact as one that come with potential harm. And I've also put the link in there to our feedback form. We are intensely grateful if anyone fills that in. As those of you in academia know, the kind of reporting cultures and the need to demonstrate the benefit of the conversations that you have so that you can have more like it in the future. Thank you so much to our four speakers for bringing your expertise and personal experience too, which is of course a form of expertise. It's been a really productive conversation, and we really appreciate your time. And thank you everyone for coming as well. It's really nice to have it so well attended. I think that's it from me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for organising it, Hannah and Laura.
Our entire pleasure. Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.